All right, all right. Okay, guys. Hey, welcome back to Getting in Tune. All right, welcome back. I'm Aaron Lynch. Um, and today I thought I would talk about a band that I believe to be the greatest hard rock band of all time. Um, Definitely the greatest band of the 70s, in my opinion, of course, but nevertheless, to say the very least, one of the greatest bands of all time. Um, that band is Led Zeppelin. I've talked about Led Zeppelin um, in passing, but never in great detail. They're my favorite band of all time. Um, and I've obviously talked about the guitarist of Led Zeppelin more than enough, that being Jimmy Page. But Led Zeppelin starts solely with Jimmy Page, and you can't talk about Led Zeppelin without talking about Jimmy Page. Um, so before Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page was in a band called the Yardbirds, and I've mentioned this before. Um, the Yardbirds, in my opinion, were probably the most influential guitar band of all time, only because of the guitarist that came through that band. The first guitarist was Eric Clapton, the second was Jeff Beck, and the third was Jimmy Page. Even though there was a period in the band where Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page were in the band at the same time. Jimmy Page played bass while Beck played guitar at one point, and then they both played guitar, but nevertheless, all three of them came through that band, which is pretty incredible. But the Yardbirds, London, 1968, the Yardbirds call it quits. But they still had a good number of shows lined up for a Scandinavian tour. Um, Jimmy Page and the bassist of the Yardbirds, Chris Dreja, decided to play or wanted to play the shows anyway, which, they didn't even have a band, but, um, so obviously they needed a singer and at least a bassist, if not another guitar player. So Page's initial choice for a new lead singer was a guy named Terry Reid, who was not really a well-known guy. However, he was opening up for the Rolling Stones at the time. So Terry Reid turned down the opportunity to play with Drea and Jimmy Page. But Terry Reid did recommend another young singer from a band called Band of Joy, and that guy's name was Robert Plant. So Page went to Robert Plant, and Robert Plant gladly accepted the offer. And Robert Plant actually gave Jimmy Page the suggestion of a drummer, and that drummer ended up being John Bonham, who was the drummer of Band of Joy, um, with Robert Plant. Um, but eventually, Chris Drea dropped out, and he wanted to become a photographer or whatever. So fine. But now, of course, they needed a new bassist, and the tour is looming, so they need one pretty fast. But eventually, um, Jimmy Page got a call from an old friend of his named John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, well, Jimmy Page, before he was in the Yardbirds, and while he was in the Yardbirds too, he was a very accomplished studio musician. He worked with bands and artists like the Rolling Stones, The Who, Marianne Faithfull, Joe Cocker, a slew of great artists from the 60s. Van Morrison's first band. So through that studio work, Jimmy Page got to know a lot of great musicians, John Paul Jones being one of them. Um, so Page obviously gained a lot of insight, and um, he started to meet a lot of people, a lot of great musicians, and he started to become more. He started to learn a lot about the world of production and recording music. But John Paul Jones heard that the Yardbirds. John Paul Jones was also an accomplished studio musician like Page, and he heard that the Yardbirds were splitting up, and he heard that Page was starting a new band. So he straight up called Jimmy Page and asked if he could join the new band. And Page, knowing John Paul Jones, said, "Yeah, absolutely, for sure." So for the Scandinavian tour, the band decided to call themselves the New Yardbirds, which not a very original name, but it makes sense, I guess, to an extent. Um, they played their first show at a record store in Denmark, and the band's chemistry was pretty great early on. It was undeniable. So much so that only a few weeks later, they went into the studio to start recording their first album. And apparently the album only took 30 hours to record, which is pretty amazing in my opinion, figuring it's number 1, their first album and considered to be one of the most influential hard rock albums of all time, but it's Led Zeppelin, so but, um, the band ran into another problem where just before the album was released, the bassist, from the Yardbirds, Chris Drea, sent a cease and desist letter to Jimmy Page and the band saying, "You cannot release an album with using the name The Yardbirds." So Page was like, "Fine," it wasn't a big deal. He had another backup name in mind, and that backup name was Lead Balloon, which was actually inspired by, the drummer of The Who, Keith Moon, who, when he heard about, um, Jimmy Page's new band, he made a comment saying, "Oh, yeah, they're not gonna do too good. They're gonna go down like a lead balloon." And Page, sort of poking fun at Keith Moon's poking fun at the band, he wanted to call the band Lead Balloon. Not a great name, obviously, and the band would agree with that, so, they decided to have a discussion, the whole band and their manager, Peter Grant, so, you know, they ended up modifying the name and coming up with, you know, in my opinion, one of the greatest, if not the greatest band name of all time, which is Led Zeppelin. I mean, that's just an awesome name if you ask me. But, their first show was they finished the Scandinavian tour, they recorded their first album, and their first show as Led Zeppelin was on October 25th of, 1968 at, University of Surrey. Zeppelin then scored, a contract with Atlantic Records, um, and their new tour manager, Richard Cole, got the band their first, North American tour, which was, a pretty big deal. But during that North American tour, Atlantic Records, released, Zeppelin's self-titled debut album on January 12th, 1968, and the album was an immediate radio hit, but was torn to shreds by critics, um, especially Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone magazine was kind of infamous for trashing a lot of who we consider to be, the great rock bands, of the '60s and '70s. They weren't fans of Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and The Who and, Cream. I think they even tore. But the band spent spent most of 1969 touring, relentlessly promoting their album, and because of the fact that the album was, trashed by pretty much every single music critic. Um, they made the executive decision that they weren't gonna do interviews, they weren't gonna talk to any critics, they weren't gonna release too many singles, if any. They released a few over the years, but, not many at all, and they barely did interviews, very few. Um, but, as I said, the band spent most of 1969, touring, and in between their shows, they were writing and already recording new material, which would come to be known as, their second album, Led Zeppelin II, and this album was much, much, much heavier, so much so that some consider it to be, one of the pioneer albums of what we know as heavy metal, which is pretty cool. Um but at this point, the band was too big to stay in the clubs, and they started moving on to large, auditoriums. Um, Once again, the critics hated this album too. I couldn't tell you why, because in my opinion, it's better than their first album. I mean, regardless, every Led Zeppelin album is great in my opinion, but this one's even better than the first album. It's heavier, but I can't speak for Rolling Stone magazine at the time. But you got Whole Lotta Love, What Is and What Should Never Be, Lemon Song, you got Heartbreaker, that's just an amazing, amazing guitar solo on there, Whole Lotta Love as well. Um, and then you got Ramble On, which is, in my opinion, one of their best songs. It's up there with, you know, Stairway and whatnot. You could those 2 go neck and neck. Um, so Zeppelin 2 was another amazing, commercial success. Critical failure, but, that's kinda what the critics were doing at the time. But for the 3rd album, the band retreated to, um, a cottage in Wales called Bron Raw, where, they spent all of their time there writing songs for their next album, which ended up being surprisingly to many people, more acoustic based. Um, Fans were really looking forward to the album, but were, somewhat surprised, and some even turned off by the switch to the more acoustic Led Zeppelin. The critics, however, were very um, welcoming of the change. They were very accepting of it. Not that the album was high praise at all by any critics, but they were more accepting of their quote unquote newer sound than what they were doing on their first and second album, which is fair. I mean, I guess you could say it's a more commercial sound, but they did rely on much more eclectic influences for this album. They turned to folk music and even Celtic music, which is pretty interesting. But the band didn't tour as much to promote their 3rd album, um, but they instead focused on writing more songs. This is, 1970 at this point. Um, and at this point, Led Zeppelin was quickly becoming the most popular and influential band on the planet, and they were about to be even bigger with the release of their next album, their 4th album, which never officially had a title, um, but given the titles of the first 3 albums, fans, understandably started calling it Led Zeppelin 4. Um, and they recorded their 4th album, excuse me, from December of 1970 to February of 1971. Um, and it was recorded at a house, on the English countryside called, Headley Grange. And they used, figuring there was no studio in the house, obviously, they used, a mobile studio that was invented for the Rolling Stones, which is pretty interesting. Um but they wrote all their songs at Headley Grange, they recorded them. You hear stories of how on the song "When the Levee Breaks," John Bonham put his drum set at the bottom of this giant stairwell, so that's where that natural echo comes from on that. That's one of the greatest drum tracks of all time. You hear stories about how, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones were, they were always visited by, a black Labrador retriever that would always, roam the property. So they ended up naming one of their songs Black Dog after that dog. Um, they also recorded a little song called Stairway to Heaven. Maybe not so little, but the song quickly became radio gold and one of the most popular iconic rock songs of all time. The album was released on November 8th of 1971, and like Stairway to Heaven, it was just an absolute smash success, and this time, even the critics loved it, understandably. It became the band's highest selling album with with, um, with an estimated, I believe it was 37 million copies sold, which is, that's a crazy number. Um, but I mean, you look at this album and it's essentially a greatest hits album. It opens with Black Dog. You got Rock and Roll right after that. Battle of Evermore, Stairway to Heaven, Misty Mountain Hop, Four Sticks, Going to California, When the Levee Breaks. That's the whole album. And those are some of their greatest songs that they ever wrote. And before they recorded the album, Jimmy Page even said, this is going to be our best album. And if it's not, you know, we're gonna quit. Like, he pretty much made a promise that they were about to write, um, their best album. This was them at their creative peak, I'd say. Well, I don't know if I'd say that. I'd say their creative peak lasted probably a few years, but this is definitely, like, their first, masterpiece, I would say. Um, but like I said, amazing, phenomenal album. Everyone loved it, fans loved it, critics loved it. It was radio gold, especially on FM radio. So that came out in '71, and, in '72, the band, once again hit the road as now the biggest band on the face of the planet, and they started playing stadiums, and sports arenas, and throughout that year, the band was, they were writing and recording new material, which would eventually make up, their 5th album, which is, entitled Houses of the Holy, which came out on, March 28th of, 1973. Um, and this album received mixed reviews, both from fans and critics, due to the fact that it was their most, experimental album at that time, um, much more so than 3. There was a funk song on it with the crunge, and there was a reggae tune, Jamaica. Um, Great songs, but, it's kind of, it's funny to say that, Zeppelin was recording reggae songs and funk songs, and I guess it could be safe to say it was weird to hear that in 1973, but I think it's one of their greatest albums to date, and it is. Like I said, it's weird to say that, but when you listen to it, you're like, "Oh yeah, that's Zeppelin." Like they can, and it just proves, when they do something like they do on 3 with the folky Celtic acoustic stuff, and the stuff they're doing on House of the Holy where they're really branching out. They're just, they're just planting, they're grounding themselves in many different areas. Pretty much proving that they could do almost anything, which they can, and easily. The album opens up with "The Song Remains the Same," which is a great driving, powerful opening track, and that goes right into the Rain song, which is pretty much the antithesis to that. It's this calm, sort of lilting, ethereal, just beautiful ballad. Um, then, of course, you have "Over the Hills and Far Away," which is probably my favorite Led Zeppelin song, aside from "Stairway," of course. Um, and then, like I said, you have songs like "Jamaica," which is like a reggae tune, and you have, um, "The Crunge," which is a funk kinda song, and you had a song like "Dancing Days," which is kind of a weird guitar riff. I think that one's in sort of a weird time signature too. Um, and then it closes with "The Ocean," which is just, I mean, that's a heavy song. I mean, the drumming in that is really, really freaking heavy. That's a great, great hard rock song. Definitely one of Zeppelin's best. Um and after the album's release, the band shattered box office records, records held by the Beatles they were breaking. They sold out 3 nights at Madison Square Garden. I believe that was, June, um, it was either June or July. I'm pretty sure it was June 27th to 29th at Madison Square Garden, and those 3 concerts, they filmed, but we'll get back to that footage. Um, and, when, bands obviously start getting bigger, egos start to get bigger, the money, they get a lot of money, they have more access to substances and whatnot, and, things are starting to heat up in the band, so much so that John Paul Jones wanted to quit the band at this point. Um, but, the manager, Peter Grant, talked him into staying, and that pretty much the band pretty much realized that they needed some time off. Um, and, they deserved it. I mean, they pretty much release an album every year since the band was created. This is 1973. The band was created in '68. So, this is not, and they have 5 albums out already. This is a short period of time. But 1974 was mostly quiet. They didn't really tour. They played maybe a few shows here and there, but like I said, they needed a break. But in 1974, the band, ended up creating their own record label, called Swan Song, and, their first album on Swan Song, came out in 1975, February 24th of 1975, and that album was Physical Graffiti. Um, this is easily their most diverse album. Um, I mean, that's you could pretty much, assume that. I mean, it's a double album. It's a very, very long album, but immediate commercial success. Like I said, huge album. Not a huge radio hit, not as much as 4, um, but everyone loved it. So, critics loved it, and it's this album, they hadn't released an album in 2 years at that point, which is a long time for Led Zeppelin. And, the album spiked spiked the sales of all their previous albums. Um, and, they toured for this album, as they should. They played Earl's Court, which was the biggest arena in, the United Kingdom, I believe, at the time. They sold out, I think, 3 shows there. Um, so 75 was definitely a great year for the band. In 76, or it might have been in late 75, I have to double check. Robert Plant, and his wife Maureen were, um, on vacation in Greece, and they got into a bad, bad car crash, and Plant broke his ankle while his wife, almost died if it hadn't have been for a blood transfusion. So Plant was obviously shooken up by that. He was in a wheelchair. Um, so since he couldn't play on stage, they decided to immediately go back and record some new material in the latter months of 75, um, which would actually turn out to be their 7th album, Presence. Um, like I said, Plant was in a wheelchair and he had to sing out of a wheelchair. So his vocal performance on Presence wasn't as strong as it was on, all of their previous albums. I mean, that makes sense. Like I said, he was in a wheelchair, his ankle was broken, his wife almost just died, whatever. This is the first album where I'm pretty sure every single song except for one, it's either every song except for one or every single song was just written by, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. Um, but that came out on March 13th of, 1976. They did not tour to, support Presence, but the footage that was, recorded in 1973 of their Madison Square Garden shows, was made into a feature film, which was entitled "The Song Remains the Same" after the The Song Remains the Same after on, Houses of the Holy. Um, and that's a great movie. It compiles footage of it's mainly the footage of, their 73 shows at Madison Square Garden, plus, like, these little sort of fantasy sequences, plus also it shows, like, some backstage footage, which in I always love to see backstage footage of bands. Um, it also, cuts to, some news footage of while they were in New York at I'm not sure if they were staying at the Drake Hotel, but, they were keeping, about $1 million in, a hotel, deposit box at the Drake Hotel, and that was stolen. They were robbed $1 million. And I'm not sure if it was $1 million then or if that was adjusted for inflation. If it's $1 million now, I'm not too sure, but, it was $1 million regardless. So, obviously, Peter Grant, their manager, was not too happy about that. But the movie otherwise was phenomenal. I love that movie so much. I watch it all the time, and, if you're getting into Led Zeppelin, I definitely recommend watching, The Song Remains the Same, only because that's pretty much Led Zeppelin at their creative peak in '73. At least as a live band, that's them at their height. Um, but that came out in '76, October 20th, and they toured in 1977, which was not a great year for the band at all. Many of their shows, there were a lot of riots at a lot of their shows. They, at one show, I forget where it was, but, it might have been at the, Silver Dome, I think, actually, but, somebody fell from the 3rd level of the Silver Dome and died, so, just terrible, terrible things were happening, at their shows for some odd reason, um, and at this point, the band was really, especially Jimmy Page and, John Bonham. Jimmy Page was heavily, heavily addicted to, hard drugs like heroin, and John Bonham was drinking excessively. So that was obviously affecting everything that was going on, especially their live shows. Jimmy Page and John Bonham really weren't sounding as good as they should and as good as they are. Um, but the tour in '77 was actually abruptly cut short after Robert Plant um, learned that his son had died of a stomach virus. His son was only, I'd say, 7 or 8 or something like that. He died from a stomach virus. So obviously the band um, just called it quits on the entire tour. It was only an American tour. The Zeppelin didn't tour England or Europe since '75, only to avoid taxes. I don't know why they would need to do that, but they did. So they toured America, and that's when the '77 tour happened, and that was uh, a disaster for the most part. So '77 was not a great year for the band. Plant had to stop. The band had to stop. Plant's son had passed away, so rightfully so. They need to, take a break. And the band remained quiet for most of 1978. No one really saw or heard from Led Zeppelin in 1978, but they were itching to record new material by the end of 1978, which they did. They started writing their eighth and final album, which is called In Through the Outdoor, which came out in '79. Um, and In Through the Outdoor is a very, very interesting album for sure. Um, it's their most experimental album, um, especially, you know, John Paul Jones really, you can tell he sort of spearheaded that whole album because the whole album is very keyboard heavy, it's very synth heavy. Um, the album's great. I mean, like I said, every Led Zeppelin album is great, but you can tell that they were um, leaning in more of a pop radio friendly direction, which is fine. There's no problem with that. But they had songs on the album like All My Love, Fool in the Rain, Carouselamba, I'm Gonna Crawl, all pretty much keyboard and piano driven for the most part. I mean, you have, the hard rock and guitar tracks on there like Hot Dog and In the Evening, which is a great opening song. But yeah, it's a very experimental album, very a pop radio friendly album, which it was. And it was a complete commercial success. Um, and yeah, Into the Outdoor is a good album for sure, and it's a great album. But a lot of people, even today, I talk to people. They're like, "Oh yeah, it doesn't sound like a Led Zeppelin album," which I honestly would disregard that comment only because um, had Led Zeppelin continued after this album, this is their final album, they would have kept changing their sound as they were throughout literally all of the '70s. Um, because I listened to Robert Plant's solo material, which started coming out pretty much right after Led Zeppelin, um, the band, quit or broke up, so to speak. Um, and it's very interesting. Into the Outdoor, I will say, sounds very '80s, more so than anything else did at the time. I mean, it wasn't even the '80s yet. That's the thing. It's like Zeppelin was already sounding like what bands were going to sound like before they started sounding like them. So, um, it makes me wonder, would Led Zeppelin have started to sound like Robert Plant's solo stuff, which was more poppy and synth driven, and would they start to sound more new wave? It begs the question, and it makes me wonder. But that's In Through the Outdoor, their final album, um, which is a good album. I love every Led Zeppelin album, but like I said, it started to sound like they were gonna go in a totally different direction had they continued as a band. But at this time, things were even worse, especially for Jimmy Page and John Bonham with the drugs and alcohol. It was getting almost out of control, so much so that on their tour in 1980, which was a low key tour, they were playing smaller venues. Um, John Bonham actually ended up uh, passing out in the on during the third song of the set, which is just awful and not good at all. But on September 25th, 1980, John Bonham, uh, while practicing or rehearsing with the band, he took some odd 40 shots of vodka or something like that, and he ended up dying that night in his sleep, and was found by John Paul Jones. And so that was 1980, and understandably, the entire band said, "Okay, we can't do this anymore," especially without John Bonham. I mean, he was really the, foundation for that entire band, um, and that was really, that was the end of it all. Everything came crashing down after that. They sent out a public notice saying, "We as Led Zeppelin are done as a band. We can't play anymore without John Bonham." Rightfully so, because every single member of that band was a key integral part, every single member. There wouldn't be Led Zeppelin without one of those 4 musicians. So Led Zeppelin's, reign as the greatest band, um, ended in 1980, even though they're still considered one of the greatest bands of all time, but, obviously, they're not around anymore. Will they ever play again? Probably not. I'd say no. The last time they played was in 2007. They reunited a few times since, Bonham's death. They reunited in 1980, I believe it was no, it was 1985 because it was for Live Aid. So they reunited at Live Aid, which is not a good performance. It was terrible. Uh, Robert Plant, his voice was off. Jimmy Page was still on drugs at the time, even worse than he was in 1980, so he wasn't doing great. Plus, Phil Collins, was on the drums during the set, and he's an amazing drummer. Phil Collins is a phenomenal drummer, but apparently he didn't rehearse any of the songs beforehand, so that obviously contributed to, you know, terrible performance. But, I mean, that whole performance is sort of infamous among, Led Zeppelin fans. But, in 1988, I believe, they reunited again for, I forget what it was, but it had something to do with, Atlantic Records, some sort of anniversary or something of Atlantic Records. But they reunited, and that performance was good for the most part. And after that, Page and Plant, started to do their own thing. They without, John Paul Jones, it was just, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant doing their own solo projects, just covering Led Zeppelin songs live, which was good, but, it was just them trying to rehash what they were doing in the '70s. Like I said, which is fine, but, it's obviously not gonna be the same thing. And then in 2007, is when they officially reunited for this is sort of like the quintessential Led Zeppelin reunion show. Um, it had Jimmy Page on guitar, obviously, Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, and it had John Bonham's son, Jason Bonham, on the drums. And, at this point, they're all in their early 70s, I think, maybe late 60s, and they sound just as good as they did in the '70s. It's incredible. There's a magic to that band that's undeniable. And if they get up on stage now, I wouldn't doubt them sounding as good as they did in 2007 or even back in the day. So they reunited a few times, and Robert Plant has said over and time again that they're not going to tour. He doesn't want to, which I get because, Led Zeppelin was Led Zeppelin. Now they're doing their own thing. Um, But, however, Jimmy Page is sort of keeping everything sort of anonymous. No one ever really hears from Jimmy Page anymore. He's sort of like a recluse. Um, but he's always sort of teased it. He always teased, getting back up on stage, even though he's literally never been on stage since probably, like, 2010 or something like that. So, who knows? Something could happen, but I doubt it. Page, after Led Zeppelin, had a few projects. He started, like, arranging and composing some weird stuff. He did, like, a Death Wish movie. He had a solo record called Outrider, which is pretty good. I like that record. I'm a huge Jimmy Page fan, so, um That's understandable, but he created a sort of super group in the early '80s called The Firm with, Paul Rodgers, who's the singer of Bad Company, and that was good. They released 2 albums, pretty solid albums, but for the most part, that's really all he's been up to, aside from the Page and Plant thing he did in the '90s. And John Paul Jones, after Led Zeppelin, pretty much stuck to, he pretty much stayed behind, the music. He arranging and producing and scoring different projects. That was John Paul Jones. That was his thing after Led Zeppelin. And he's an amazing arranger and producer. Robert Plant had the most successful solo career, um, out of all the members of Led Zeppelin. He had an amazing solo career. Pretty much all of his albums that he put out were, in my opinion, great. I mean, I love all of his stuff. Some of the Page and Plant stuff is like, all right. Like I said, it's just them trying to rehash what they were doing back in the day, which is fine. But he had a lot of original work, especially what he did in 2006 with Alison Krauss, who's a country singer. They kind of made this cool, sort of folky, um, sort of gave me sort of like Joni Mitchell type vibes, which I love that sort of stuff. So Robert Plant had an amazing solo career. Um, Obviously, did anything live up to what Led Zeppelin did? Obviously not. But that being said, Led Zeppelin was one of the most influential and impactful bands of all time. Um, each member of the band is considered one of, if not the best at their respective instruments. Jimmy Page, as I've mentioned more than enough times, is one of the greatest guitarists of all time. John Paul Jones, one of the greatest um, bass players, keyboardists, arrangers ever. Uh, Robert Plant is considered one of the greatest hard rock singers ever, and John Bonham is considered the greatest hard rock drummer ever. So, you know, that pretty much speaks for itself right there. And the music sort of proves all of that. But yeah, that's Led Zeppelin, my all-time favorite band. They inspired and influenced me so much as a musician, especially Jimmy Page, as I've said, um, and all of his guitar work. But yeah, that's Led Zeppelin. That's the history of Led Zeppelin for you. Probably the greatest, like I said, greatest hard rock band of all time. And people would argue the Beatles as the greatest band of all time, which, like, I can't refute that. But, you're talking hard rock, it's Led Zeppelin. It's always gonna be Led Zeppelin. So you sort of just gotta accept that. But that's that. And yeah, thank you once again for listening. I am Aaron Lynch, as always, and this was Getting in Tune.